Welcome, folks. This is Marc Steiner, and welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Good to have you with us this week. No matter where you live in this country, you've heard of Freddie Gray. You've heard of the death of Freddie Gray at the hands of police officers in Baltimore City, and the trials that took place of the officers accused of his death, who then won their cases in those courts. So it gripped the country, it gripped the city, obviously. Rebellion took place after Freddie Gray was killed and continued. And the city has really never been the same since. And it's emblematic of the situation in this country, no matter where you live in America. And our guest today is Yoes, who wrote the book, Baltimore After Freddie Gray. Now, Sean is also the editor of the Baltimore Afro-American newspapers and is the co-host of Truth and Reconciliation with Taya Graham and Stephen Janis, who are reporters here at the Real News Network, and joins us here in our studios for the Marc Steiner Show. And Sean, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Good to see you, Marc, as always.
So this is always great to see you. So this book, I mean, I know you followed this trial. You followed what happened intensely when he was killed and when the rebellion took place, and they locked the kids up from being able to get to their transportation around Mondawmin Mall on the west side of Baltimore. But something drove you to write this book that came out of the columns that you wrote for the Afro-American.
Yeah. I think I thought then, and I obviously think now, that it's really important to tell our stories from a perspective of Baltimore, as opposed to, I think one of the things that really sparked me to write this book was after the officers were charged. And remember how all the different news organizations, CNN, MSNBC, all kind of converged on the city, and there was that big rally at City Hall. And I just remember looking at those people who were covering us and reporting back about the city, and I just kept thinking, they don't know anything about us. They don't know anything about this city. And I just think that it's super important for people like you and people like me who are born and raised here. That doesn't mean people who aren't born and raised here can't tell the Baltimore story. But I think it is very important for people like you and I to tell our story. And so that's really at the foundation of why I wanted to put these columns together and the other work as far as the forwards are concerned, in order for us to have the most authentic voice possible to speak to these really critical years in our city post the death of Freddie Gray and the subsequent uprising.
You mentioned the foreword. The introduction to the book is written by Larry Gibson, one of our noted attorneys in this country, who's run campaigns across the globe, and gave a great history of Black Baltimore in the 19th and early 20th century, which I thought was really good. Really set the tone for all of it.
Him and Frances Murphy Draper, the publisher of the Afro, the granddaughter of Carl Murphy, the man who led the Afro through the golden age. So they're like two living portals of history to our city, and I was really fortunate, very blessed to have them both be able to help set the context, the historical context of what transpired in those days and those years, the 3 years after Freddie Gray.
Let's get to the heart of this. Well, there are a number of things here that I think are really important, because you divided the book up into a series of chapters based on the columns that you wrote that cover a lot of Baltimore. They all tie into this issue of Freddie Gray and his death. But let's talk about some names here, right? Sure. So in the book, we talk about Lawrence Scooter, Corin Gaines, Charmaine Wilson, and Cody Young, Tyrone West, and of course Freddie Gray. Yeah. All people who were murdered and killed in the city. Yeah. Some of these people were murdered in interchanges with the police. Some people were murdered on the street by men and women in the street. Yeah. So, but in some senses, you, in a spiritual and political sense, put them together. Yeah, right. So talk a bit about why you did that and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, to go back even further, if you go to the dedication of my book, I dedicated to my mother, who was murdered in 2004. She's a part of it too, and I think the point is that there are so many victims of violence in our city. You know, I was having a conversation with a young woman on the way over here, and I had said to her, you know, we were talking about the fact that my mother had been killed in the city, and the whole point of making her a part of the book was not just to pay my respect and my honor, pay homage and give my love to my mother. It was to show that there are thousands of people like me in this city who have lost loved ones to violence, and their killers are still walking among the people.
Your mother's killer's never been
No,
found.
right. But there's so many people like me in this city. Since the book has been published, there have been a lot of people who have said to me, you know what, my sister got killed, was murdered. My mother was murdered. I mean, think about that. I mean, there are literally thousands of people walking the streets of Baltimore whose loved ones were taken because of violence, and that's part of the conversation of the book, I believe.
Literally. I mean, when you have murders happening 300 a year for years and years and years, as I told you before we went on the air, that when I first started my radio show in 1993, for the first 10 years of the show, I was covering what was going on in our city. I was also covering many other things, including what was going on in Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Right.
More people were killed in that period of those 10 years in Baltimore than were killed in Belfast in the middle of a war.
Sure.
So we're talking about a war zone that
absolutely
erupts in a place like our city.
And we were talking offline, before we started. In 93, when you started, we were 10 years into the crack epidemic in Baltimore City, really. And so in some ways, we've never recovered from that. And then when we talk about mass incarceration with the zero tolerance policing policy, we still haven't recovered from that failed policing strategy.
Let me slowly kind of try to connect the dots and some of the ones you just connect in your book through your columns.
Sure.
So when we take the tragic murder of your mother, let's say, and other people in the city, and you're the son of a postman.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
A working class kid who grew up in Baltimore.
I am the embodiment of that kid, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're not talking about a kid who had to live with his family inside the projects in the heart of an inner city neighborhood.
But still the heart of West Baltimore, but not
the heart of West Baltimore.
Yeah.
Right. So but that says a lot when we think about the people whose lives are sacrificed in a city like this. And people think, okay, well, poor kid comes from the black streets, he's on the corner, of course, he's got to confront this stuff, blah, 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 every day of his life. But it's so much deeper than that.
Absolutely.
And I think what you're describing in the book is the depth of it, in many ways, and not our common perception of what it really is.
Oh, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that, you know as well as I do, maybe even better than I do, the perception of Baltimore, from the outside in particular, people, they really believe. I had friends from Chicago, talk to me about Baltimore. Like, oh my God,
Chicago.
From Chicago. Oh, is it that? Is it really that bad? I'm like, you're from Chicago. And they're like, but we saw The Wire. And it's a weird thing, though. I mean, I don't disparage David for making The Wire. I was in The Wire. I had a part in the role in The Wire. We both had parts.
In The Wire.
Right, we both were in The Wire. So I would never disparage David for telling his story. But the point is that the outside world gravitates to those images and those stories. And as you just said so smartly, it's much deeper than that, I think. You know?
So what's the connection for you between the death of a Lawrence Scooter, who was a rapper who was in the gang life himself a little bit, trying to get out of it, but went to an anti-violence rally himself and was murdered, to the death of Freddie Gray, who died at the hands of police. So for you, what is that connection? Because you put them together in many ways in the list at the beginning of the book, and you tell their stories throughout the book. So what's the connection?
Well, I think that you speak to, wow, that's a great question. You speak to it a little bit, or you kind of alluding to it as you gave me the question. Lil Scooter is on his way back from a Stop the Violence rally, and he is at a traffic light, and some cat runs up and kills him. Allegedly, there was some beef that had been going back and forth. Freddie Gray, he had scrapes with the law. He had been in and out of jail a little bit. He had some issues, obviously, with drug addiction. But on that day, he was just thinking about when we're going to eat for breakfast.
Right.
And he winds up getting, locked up and eventually losing his life. Two young black men who were not immersed in the element that usually takes young men's lives at that moment in time, but because of circumstances or because of their past or because of what they may have gone through in the past, it's almost as if the streets pull you back in and you become a victim of what may have happened in the past or what might. It's always in Baltimore, not always, but oftentimes it's about perception. Like, I had a cat once say to me once, he had just gotten back home from jail, and he said the reason why most guys get into conflicts and die in Baltimore is because they hear that somebody is looking for them, and the attitude is, I'm not going to let him come get me. I'm going to go get him.
Right.
And that happens, that narrative plays itself out over and over and over again in our city. And there's something about that that has to be broken and has to be cured, but that's a whole, I think.
And it's not just the cities, it's beyond the city. I mean, it affects women as men as it does men. You write about Corinne Gaines, who was a young woman who was killed by Baltimore County policemen. Yeah. In a situation that many people think she could have been talked out of where she was rather than shot, right? And had she been probably white in a different situation, she may not have been shot.
You remember Joe Palczynski.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. We can tell that story in a minute, and how that fits. And then you talk about Charmaine Wilson, who reported to the police that her son was beaten up and his bicycle seat taken, and then she was murdered.
Right. His siblings had been bullied. She had been bullied. I mean, she had attempted to call police on drug dealers on numerous occasions.
So there's an arc here to me. I mean, and I'm curious about how you think about it in terms of all the columns you wrote and the chapters you wrote here, just about that arc between, I think it was Ivan Potts you wrote about, a young man who came out of prison, who said that the police were a gang, that they run up on you just like any other gang.
I'll never forget what he said specifically.
Say it. Go ahead.
He said the cops looked at him like, we're just like you. That his perception of what the police were trying to convey to him, because two of the cops who arrested him were members of the Gun Trace Task Force. Their energy was like, we're just like you. We just have badges. We just have guns that have been issued by the state. But there was no real line in between Ivan Potts and the police that arrested him, and ultimately that's what freed him.
So if you take the other part, you spend a lot of time in the book also writing about men and women who are trying to do something to change the situation we're in.
Right.
And you write about people like Erica Bridgeford, who started Ceasefire, which has done amazing work, and David Miller, another son of the West Side who went to your high school, Walbrook High School, right? Yeah. That you write about as Walbrook Warriors.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Get it correct.
For those of you around the country who don't understand, in Baltimore, when we talk about stuff, when they say, what school did you go to? They talk about high school.
It's never college. It's always high school. Forest Park. No, city.
City, man.
City.
I was expelled.
Well, you went to... sometimes I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that.
So what I want to raise here is you're also talking about men and women who are trying to make a difference in kind of actually doing things to ameliorate the violence and change the nature of people's lives in the city. So what do you learn from that? What do we learn from that? What does the city learn from David Miller and Erica Bridgeford?
When you think, and those two are the...
And this city could be any city in America right now, by the way. Right?
Truth. When you think about specifically David and Erica, and you think about how hard they grind every single day, it's love. And that's the unifying thread that runs through all of those stories of the people that I write about who are doing this incredible work, whether it's Erica Bridgeford or Latrice Gant or Ogun Gordy or David Miller or Cameron Miles or Ray Kelly or Nicole Mundell. It's the love for the city and for the people of the city. That's what it's all about.
So how do you think, from all you've written about, and as you've covered as a, as you call yourself a pundit, as you cover stuff on the on the radio show you had First Edition for all those years, right? So you've been covering this for a long time, and now as editor of the Baltimore Afro-American and writing this book. I'm curious, how you translate the pain of what we've seen in terms of the deaths and what happens to people in this community, the people who are really trying to change things that you write about, and even the cultural worries you write about in the book. When you talk about numbers of people who are doing things to uplift the city in different ways. So how does that translate itself into what the city could be? How does it translate itself into what policy could be? How do you take that love and turn it into something that actually does something in a systemic way? I mean, you didn't write about that really, but I mean, I'm curious what you think about that.
And that's a conversation that we have all the time. I mean, you and I have had that conversation many times. How do we transfer that love into plausible policy that really works to uplift large groups of people who have historically lived on the fringes of the shining city, right? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, so you can eat. I think the obvious answer, or the answer that people give, is okay, support these people, right, with money, but it probably has to be something more than that. I mean, because I think some of the people that we talk about have been funded. Most haven't. But it's so money could be one of the answers. Money could be one of the answers. Funding, fiscal support could be one of the answers. But the question is one that begs for ongoing thought and discussion and debate and deliberation. I think that part of the answer, Mark, is I think that the machine, the political machine in Baltimore that we've been operating under since in both of our lifetimes, in a lot of ways is fundamentally broken. It doesn't mean that there is another answer with another party. That's not it. But we have to work on the machine, and as you and I had said before this interview started, there are young politicians and even ones that are veteran politicians that give us some hope. But we've seen that movie before too, so I'm hoping that it will be a different outcome. But it's hard to be optimistic about politics, especially given the environment we're operating in now, I think.
You spent a good portion of this book also talking about the culture, whether it was the work that Navashadeh does as a singer and other people in the city do in their cultural work. And you even put in there the part about you as a little boy, just want to put your ears to listen to your dad get dressed, getting ready to go to work as a postman, and what that meant to you to see your dad run off to work every day.
I mean, every day. Every day.
You called him the Cal Ripken of the post office.
It was the Cal Ripken of the post office. I'm going to tell you what stopped my dad's work streak. He was in a house. He was in a friend's house. It's a true story. He was in a friend's house. And a car crashed through the house and pinned my dad up against the wall and broke his ribs. That stopped him from going to work. Up until that point, he had worked basically every day of my life up until I was in my 20s. And it took a car to crash through a house to stop my dad from going to work. That's true. That's a true story.
So what I thought about reading your book, when you wrote that part, and also your love of music and house music thing, you wrote about house music, right?
Right.
We should have this track going on about house music under so we're talking, just for you, the Sean Yoes house music
the world
track.
Famous happy hour.
Sneaking into Odell's when you shouldn't have been.
What? I got in there. I got in.
Odell's, by the way, folks, was a nightclub in Baltimore that a lot of young folks went to, and my daughters went to. He went to, which makes me really old.
I started when I was 16. Sorry.
So, but what I was thinking about was your dad being a postal worker, that you wrote about him in some very loving ways. And a discussion I was having with another young man for another group I was helping with the other week, saying, look, in Baltimore, as in many cities around this country, one of the things that built the black middle class, the black working class in Baltimore, were jobs, and the jobs that were unionized jobs. Postal worker, working for the city, teachers union, steel workers, auto plant, working at Domino Sugar, and those have their mirror image jobs in all over the city that built this place and built people's lives. So, and now we see where we've come to. So I'm just reflecting on that. You can't reinvent the past. But in some ways we have to kind of, I was thinking about your articles how we use what we understand from the past to build what comes next.
I think the example of work, however it looks, it may not look like the old, it's not going to look like the old union jobs of the 1960s and 1970s and even up into the 1980s, I guess. But the work ethic still persists. Whether you are going to work a 9-to-5 job or you have decided to become an entrepreneur, the work ethic is still the unifying thread between anybody who's willing to go out here every single day and put their hustle forward and try to make something happen for themselves and or their family.
I mean, that's one of the things you actually write about in here, which I think is important for people to, many people in this country to wrestle with. Not everybody, but many people. You write about how many people in white America think of black folks as lazy.
Oh my God!
And you wrote about that,
especially in Baltimore. I mean,
it's all over. It's all over,
of course. But I mean, yeah, no. The point of, I used to produce a radio show. I used to produce Larry Young's show back in early 2000s.
Who, for everybody around the country, is a former state senator who has his own talk show here in Baltimore on a station.
And so I used to have to be out on the bus stop like 5 o'clock in the morning to get to the station. And the bus stop was filled with people. Get on the bus, filled with people. They're going to work. When I go to the gym early in the morning, I'm up at 4:30. I'm out of the house before 5:30. You drive past the bus stop, there's people on the bus stop getting ready to go into the first shift. The working people of Baltimore are the backbone of the city. And I suspect it's the same thing in Cleveland, in Detroit, Chicago, LA, wherever. It's the working class people who make the city run. They're the engine of the city. It's not the people who are operating 1,000 feet above ground in the gleaming towers. It's the people down on the ground who make the city run. And without them, I'll say this, let everybody take the day off and see how the city runs.
I've always wanted to see like this massive general strike take place. Vice doesn't go to work. Then we see what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Then we see what happens.
Yeah.
Right? So if you were to tie your essays together, you wrote the conclusion, but if you were to tie your essays together, post Freddie Gray, Baltimore, and it could be post a lot of people dead in a lot of cities, but post Freddie Gray, Baltimore. I mean, how do you tie that together for us? To tie together the idea of the power of culture, the power of these people who are trying to make a difference with these senseless deaths, whether at the hands of gangbangers in the street or in the hands of the police.
I think that, and I say this because I believe it, I'm typically an optimistic man, but I'm more optimistic about our city because I know the people that do the work. Many of them have become my friends. So that's the reason why I'm more optimistic, despite all of the challenges that we face as a city. However, with that optimism, I would implore the leaders of the city, the political leaders of the city, to help in a more maybe innovative way, to be even more zealous, to be as hopeful and optimistic about the city as the people that I write about. Because if they are, then they would try to maybe bend a little bit further, just to, all we need is all a lot of the people that do the work that we write about, that we know need, is a little bit of support, I think, to make a drastic change. I hope. But again, I am optimistic. I think that there are structural issues with law enforcement, obviously. There are structural issues with the Baltimore City Public Schools. There are structural issues with housing. There are structural issues about how we approach poor people in Baltimore that have to be changed. But I still stand by what I say about the people who are doing the work now. And if they weren't doing the work, I don't know, we may not even have a city. So.
Sean Yoes, it's always good to see you.
You too, man.
Thank you for the work you do. It's good to have you in the studio here with us.
Appreciate you.
And folks, we've been talking to Sean Yoes about his book, Baltimore After Freddie Gray. This book could be written about your city. St. Louis, Chicago, Des Moines, LA, New York, wherever you're living at this moment. And it's a book to read, to think about, to translate into the work you do in your own communities. So do that and check this out. And Sean, once again, thank you so much for having me with us.
I appreciate you.
And I'm Marc Steiner for the Real News Network. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Talk to you all next week.